So time to see what the Holy Sisters of the Emperor can do on the tabletop in 10th edition, and it looks like they're bringing a new scary indirect fire version of the Exorcist to the table, and apparently throwing more miracle dice around than just about ever before. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking Sisters of Battle. Games Workshop has let the new rules drop for their faction focus, and now we've got their army rule, detachment rule for their launch detachments, and a lot more besides. Let's talk about how the Sisters are going to be putting forward their holy trinity of Flamer, Melter and Bolter into the enemy in 10th. The reveals follow the similar sort of pattern to Games Workshop's other faction previews. We've got their full army rule, plus their detachment special rule for the Hallowed Martyrs Detachment, a couple of fun weapons and a stratagem, plus datasheets for the Triumph of St. Katherine and the Battle Sister Squad. Besides the major reveals, just from a look at the datasheets, it does look like a few mechanics are alive and well. It still seems that at least all the actual sisters in the army will be getting an invul save. The Battle Sisters appear to have retained their 6+. I'd guess with no deny the witch mechanic though, that mini psychic defense that they all had has almost certainly gone away. Looks like the Ministorum Flamers do still get their +1 strength, so the regular Flamers are strength 5 and the heavy Flamers are strength 6. That will give them a bit of an edge on most of the Flamers in the 40k galaxy. Nice to see that their special thing is alive and intact. And as with other flame weapons, they also seem to ignore cover now. Definitely a nice benefit for flushing the enemy out. They also said that many units can be joined by 2 characters rather than 1. Again, that's a change that I think makes sense, to be honest, given that the Sisters tend to have a fairly large amount of support characters, things like their Hospitallers and Dog Martyrs and things, alongside their more traditional HQ choices like the Canoness Missionaries and the Palatine. Otherwise, for the other bits, we've also got their army rule as Acts of Faith, broadly unchanged for miracle dice, but it does look like there's some changes to generation, a bit of a side grade from the core rules, but it looks like there's a lot of other ways to get them, particularly on the Battle Sister Squad. Their launch detachment is apparently going to be the Hallowed Martyrs Detachment. This will be the standard one that they have until their codex comes out. It sounds like this one is really quite tailored to the Our Martyr Lady style of playing, the one where you take casualties and then you get damage buffs on your units. Otherwise, for the rules reveals, we've got Morvenn Meelee's new melee profile, the Exorcist missiles, which now ignore line of sight, really quite interesting that becoming a big artillery piece for the Sisters now, and a nice return fire stratagem for when the enemy kills your models, potentially putting out some punishing damage in their own turn. Finally, we've got a couple of datasheets for the Triumph of St. Katherine and the standard Battle Sister Squad, both of which look pretty interesting, and again can be generating a lot more interesting miracles. First up, let's start with the big stuff, and Acts of Faith. The Sisters' core faction special rule, as I think most people would have expected, is still miracle dice. My suspicion is that the sacred rites might have just gone away entirely, or I suppose they might be realised on a different detachment that they have when their codex comes out. First up, for the ways that they're generated, it looks like there's a lot of ways to do so now. There's only 2 things on this rule. You get one at the start of each turn, so I guess your opponent's and yours there, and also you get one every single time one of your sisters' units is destroyed. This one no longer locks to just being 1 unit destroyed per phase. If your opponent wipes out a huge chunk of your army, you're going to be getting a whole bunch of miracles. As before, it's the same system where you basically roll the dice and set that aside, then you can substitute in that number for one of the different rolls, as we'll see in a second. For generation though, things have generally got even better, I'd say, for the Sisters. They have lost the core rule where you get a miracle dice for killing a unit in a phase. That one is a bit of a nerf, I suppose, but I think it's probably outweighed by the fact that the losing unit isn't phase restricted anymore. But it still looks like a fair few units in your army might still be able to generate one like that by having a simulacrum in the unit, one of the Sisters' little banner bearer things, and then if your unit with the simulacrum in kills an enemy unit, then you will gain a miracle dice for that. Could be kind of handy for things like your standard Battle Sisters, Celestians, and Dominions maybe. On top of that though, there's another couple of datasheet specific things. One of the easiest looking ones is that if you've got a Battle Sister squad hanging out on an objective, if you have that in your command phase, then you gain a miracle dice at the end of them just by taking that point. It means that if you could have 3 different objectives held in your command phase by Battle Sister squads, that would be 3 free miracle dice, really getting the faith train rolling. Finally, it also looks like if a unit's got a cherub, then you can basically have a free miracle. If you use a miracle dice on a unit with a cherub, then you can immediately generate 1 more. I suppose it's a bit hit and miss what the value might be, but again that's going to be another way to avoid depleting your pool. Overall, between all this, it still looks like there's going to be a lot of ways to get miracle dice on the table, hopefully fish for those 6s and plug them into some really big rolls. It's a very powerful mechanic, and I'm sure Sisters will appreciate it staying. Talking of those rolls, these are the ones that you can use it on. There has been a bit of a change to the way that you spend them, in that it's no longer locked to just the one miracle per phase. Previously, if you wanted to do multiple miracles per phase in your army, you'd need those simulacrums. Now they look like they're a way of generating them, and across your army, each unit can do a single miracle per phase, so you could spend a whole load of miracle dice in the shooting phase if you wanted to, across different units. Really quite nice and de-restrictive, to be honest. I don't really see why there was much need to stop other units from using the same mechanic if you wanted to. As before, the system works kind of similar. You take a miracle dice and you just substitute that into a roll before you make it. It counts as an unmodified result, and you can apply them to advanced rolls, battle shock tests, charge rolls, damage rolls, hit rolls, saving throws, and wound rolls. I'd say literally any of those could be pretty usable given the right situation. In 10th edition, it does look like the leadership sort of test won't be a way of disposing of junk dice. Previously, when a 1 was an auto pass, that could be a good target to use them on. Now though, you still need to try and roll high for leadership, so you're not going to be able to spend your 1s there. As before though, this is going to be really quite powerful. You can plug flat 6 damages into melter weapons that go through. You can potentially have a very good chance of making long charges with units arriving from reserve, or just things that would have been quite risky otherwise. And things like 3 and 4s can be pretty good for things like hits, wounds, or saving throws, particularly if your units have got a high invul. Very solid, and looks like there may be more miracle dice flying around than before. Moving on to the Sisters' main detachment rule, that is the Blood of Martyrs, and this one's going to be in the Hallowed Martyrs detachment, which to me very much sounds like it's going to be an Our Martyr Lady one. This one's definitely keeping with the spirit of injured units do better, and the army rule is that you get a +1 to hit if your unit's below starting strength, and then a +1 to wound if the unit is below half strength as well. For single model units, they clarified that it's below starting strength if it takes even 1 wound, so that means that you get the +1 to hit on tanks and vehicles quite easily. I'm just a little bit confused though that they've left out that rider for the +1 to wound section. I'd guess that probably means that your single model units won't be getting the +1 to wound thing as well, though I feel like that's definitely a little bit ambiguous as to what their intent is there. Could probably do with a touch of explanation. Still though, for the units that it applies to, it's really quite a potent damage buff. If you're hitting on a 3+, then that's usually going to be a +25% damage increase to any damaged units, particularly nice for any tanks and vehicles I suppose, and it would also have the advantage of outweighing the -1 to hit that they seem to get when they're heavily injured. If you can get both buffs triggered, then the +1 to hit and +1 to wound will usually be around at least a +60% damage buff overall. A huge amount of increased damage there, and your last models in the squads will hit very very hard. It is going to punish your opponent a bit if they can injure units but not wipe them out. From their wording, it does sound like it's going to literally apply to all the units in the army. Previously, things like the Munitorum units wouldn't get the sort of Sisters chapter tactic equivalent, but given that everything in the army is going to get the Adepta Sororitas keyword on the faction section, I don't believe that these guys will get locked out. Overall, I do think it's pretty solid. Definitely the potential for a lot more damage here, though I would bear in mind that it does have enemy counterplay. If your opponent just focuses on whittling down full units rather than injuring them, then you're not going to get this triggered quite as much. I feel like that was one of the main reasons that Our Martyr Lady didn't tend to get played quite so much during 9th edition, but admittedly this rule is stronger than the one that they had in 9th. The +1 to wound thing didn't exist previously. Otherwise, we've got a couple of weapon profiles. Probably the less exciting one is Morvenn Melee. They've previewed her Lance of Illumination, and broadly it just seems kind of similar to how it is now, a little bit less AP. That might be a bit nasty on her strike profile if she's trying to punch up against tough stuff. Might not matter so much on her anti-horde mode. I guess in theory the devastating wounds could be a little bit more powerful on her strike mode depending on how you look at it. On 6s she now gets her regular damage replaced by 3 mortal wounds. Previously it would have been 1 mortal wound in addition to regular damage. Kinda depends on whether your opponent had a good invul save or not. Overall I'd say that might be a tiny bit stronger. Certainly could be nice if you plugged in a 6 miracle dice to it I suppose. It's kind of interesting that remaining strength 8 is kind of basically a nerf though at this point. She was strength 8 before, so wounding things like a bunch of land raiders on 4s and rhinos on 3s. Now for basically all vehicles she's going to be wounding them on a 5+ now. She's lost a fair bit of power against tough stuff. A lot more exciting though I think is this new Exorcist Barrage profile, and it seems that they've reimagined this tank to be basically an artillery piece. Previously there was a far too expensive stratagem that allowed it to fire out of line of sight for a turn, but now it seems that that's just baked in on its scary missiles, and I suppose that'll give it a bit more of a niche against the Castigator, which will be the direct line of sight tank. As they've shown this off, they've told us the new profile for indirect fire, and it does seem like it's kept that nerf that it acquired mid-9th edition, a -1 to hit if your opponent can't be seen, and also the enemy gains the benefit of cover as well unless you've got some way to ignore it, so that would usually be the same +1 to their saving throw. I suppose it means firing artillery into cover might not be quite as painful as units elsewhere, as you wouldn't be gaining any additional saving throw other than what they already had. Out of the two, I still think that the anti-tank missiles probably look like the scariest, to be honest. They've dropped a bit in range to only 36 inches, so it's not going to be quite as far-reaching as before, but otherwise it gets a similar sort of number of average shots at D6 plus 2. They'll be hitting on 3 plus at strength 10, AP -2 and damage D6. That's a really good generalist profile that looks like it'd be decently good at removing both elite infantry and light vehicles. I guess the AP for it should be a bit worsened when it's firing out of line of sight, though I suppose it doesn't have to if it doesn't make sense. It will be able to counteract the -1 to hit though, as it has the heavy keyword, so if you remain static then it'll be hitting on a 3 still. The other option are the conflagration rockets, the anti-infantry version. Previously you've had to pick between the two pre-game, and I don't suspect that that would change. These ones get 3d6 shots at strength 5, AP 0 and damage 1. Again, they get the heavy keyword, they get blast as well, and these ones also ignore cover as well, so I guess your opponent would just be saving on their base saving throw. To be fair, I could certainly see them being pretty useful for clearing something like a squad of Chaos Cultists off a backfield objective perhaps, but overall I just can't help but think unless the points differential is absolutely enormous that that's going to outweigh the ability to take down things like light tanks. Overall that's really quite interesting though, basically covers a niche in the Sisters army that they didn't have a unit for before. Next up we've got a stratagem called Rejoice the Fallen. This one again feels like it's very much in the Our Martyr Lady theme, taking casualties and come back fighting harder. This one triggers when your opponent shoots one of your sister's units and kills a model, then he basically gets to return fire with that same unit against the unit that shot them. That happens after your opponent's finished resolving their attacks. It's only 1 CP, and if you can get that to trigger on a unit that's got a decent amount of firepower left, maybe a Retributor squad that takes 1 or 2 casualties but still has a couple of multi-melters, it does seem like it could be a pretty solid return on your investments. Depending on how many casualties you've taken, you might also get the +1 to hit, and maybe even the +1 to wound as well to add insult to injury, and it could be worth it just literally for the damage alone. I guess the real money would be though if you manage to get this to gun down an enemy unit just before it's about to charge. Say you've got a mixed role unit that shoots you but doesn't kill you, if you could then prevent a charge by just gunning it down, that would be absolutely massive value. Looks like a bit of a situational one, but definitely could be very powerful in the right situation. Lastly, they've got a couple of datasheets, and they do seem to like previewing their shiny centerpiece models in these showcases, so here we have the Triumph of St. Katherine. This one's the great big mad procession of sisters with relics shielding the body of St. Katherine herself. Really quite an unusual model, as it's generally been treated as infantry, but is actually an enormous diorama base with a whole bunch of sisters on it. Broadly the model does seem to be fairly similar just on its base stats alone. Still a huge amount of wounds with 18 of them, but only toughness 3, a 3+ save and a 4+ invul. Looks like it has lost the -1 to hit special rule that it had, but weirdly enough it's gained the leader keyword, so that basically implies that this massive model will now be able to join a squad somehow. I guess most of the foot sisters will be reasonable targets, anything from regular battle sisters to maybe Celestians or Sacrosants. I definitely wouldn't have guessed this model would get that rule. Looks like it might be even more annoying to remove from the table than it is currently. In combat, it previously had a couple of different weapon profiles. They've all been consolidated into one relic weapons one. Now it just gets a flat 18 attacks at strength 5, AP -2 and damage 1. Really quite solid anti-infantry there. Will be kind of good at fighting against light vehicles, but anything that it wounds on a 6, that will be very painful and it won't do much. These attacks do appear to get fewer with degrading. Once it's gone down to less than a third of wounds left, the attack's characteristic gets halved. The most interesting thing about the Triumph is the relics that it gets to use. Previously I had a system where they were all active at the start of the game, and then they'd get fewer as models died. Now it's basically a pick your own command phase buff once more. You get to pick 2 out of this selection of 6, but again when it's down to 5 wounds or less you only get to pick 1. The buffs are pretty interesting, and it does mean that it could be quite flexible depending on how you want to use it against your opponents. I'd say one of the most interesting is the first one. Nearby dead units within 6 inches generate 6s on their miracle dice that they drop, potentially giving you a whole bunch of really useful rolls. Potentially I feel like this one could be genuinely very powerful. Basically have the Triumph shielded by a tough infantry squad, and then have a whole bunch of chaff units around it, maybe individual penitent engines, small units of the Munitorum models maybe, or even just small squads of battle sisters, and it means that when your opponent guns them down as easy targets, you'll get some very powerful dice to plug into your damage dealing. Seems like that could be a very viable strategy on paper. Otherwise, there's a +1 leadership aura, which seems a little bit on the underwhelming side. There's one where you get to use multiple acts of faith per phase on any units within the 6 inches. I guess if you desperately want to plug in multiple miracle dice to make your unit extra dangerous, that could be handy on multi-melters perhaps. There's an interesting one that buffs your bolters and things, +1 attack to rapid fire weapons within 6 inches. Seems like that could be a potential way to make your regular bolt guns a bit more dangerous. That'd be 2 shots each out to 24 inches or 3 shots out to 12. Then there's a nice predictable 6+ feel no pain type aura. That one seems like it's perhaps one of the easiest to use, and I feel like that could be a staple pick. Making your army just flat tougher is rarely a bad idea. And finally, and I think another good one, is an aura of lethal hits on melee weapons. 6 is to hit auto wound in combat, and I feel like that will be really quite good on their own relic weapons. They're attacking with a whole flurry of fairly low strength but reasonable AP attacks. That could be a way to have it punch up just a little bit against things like tanks and vehicles. Overall, looks like it's going to remain a fairly fun and pretty mad model. Efficiency, as always, will depend on the points cost that it has, but if it's pointed right, I feel like it could be pretty interesting as the same annoying mid-board type threat, perhaps particularly being a miracle dice farm, but the extra damage and defensive buffs seem pretty useful too. Finally, we've got the datasheet for the standard issue Battle Sisters, and again this is a really interesting one, perhaps most so because of just how many miracle dice these girls can generate. For the main stat line, there's maybe no real surprises there. They've got a save of a 3+, leadership of a 7+, and objective control 2. I'd bear in mind that there is going to be a shift for the sisters with cover saves and things. Having a 3+ save now can't be improved to a 2+ if you happen to gain the benefit of cover. It's going to mean that your Battle Sister units just don't care about being in cover quite as much as some others. It does seem that they still get their 6+ invul save, which I guess will be useful against some things. It does seem that in 10th edition though, a lot of AP has dropped on a whole bunch of weapons. It's not really going to come into play all that often, besides against things like AP-4 Melter. A bunch of their ranged weapons we've already seen in one form or another, but a couple of them are new. Seems that the Artificer Pattern Stormbolter still gets a big damage 2 in the unit. That one's similar at 2 shots at 24 inches and 4 shots out to 12. It's not got any AP, and it looks like it doesn't have any chance to get mortal wounds now. Heavy weapons like the Heavy Bolter and Multi-Melter basically are keeping a similar sort of heavy rule to 9th. They'll get a 4+ ballistic skill normally, but the heavy weapon keyword allows them to get a +1 ballistic skill if they stay still. A lot of the time that's going to mean that they're hitting on 3s when static and 4s when moving again, but it does mean that it could be a bit of a penalty for stacking modifiers more so than before. It still seems that the Munitar and Flame weapons have the +1 to their strength ability. The regular Flamer is strength 5, appears to be a pip of strength better than most Flamers still, though on par with the Space Marine Pyre Blasters. I guess they have a similar sort of special ability now. And the Heavy Flamer is still at a decent strength 6 AP-1, that's going to be fairly general purpose still. Multi-Melters we have seen have gone to 18 inches from other previews before. I think that is going to be quite a big deal for the Sisters army for just how important that is in an anti-tank weapon. In 9th edition in particular, multi-melters tended to be the way that most Sisters lists get them done. 24 inches gave them a decent threat range. Now it's going to be a lot more possible to outrange them for certain key units, and it could be a bit of a problem for Sororitas anti-tank. The power weapon looks like it's got a generic profile that's just strength 4 AP-2, and it's kind of interesting that the bolt gun profile is a little bit different to the Space Marine versions. They had 2 shots out to 24 inches. I guess that represents the 10th edition version of the Adepta Sororitas bolter discipline, and these ones represent bolters being wielded by mere mortals. I'm still not super optimistic that regular bolt guns are going to be particularly effective in terms of damage dealing. I suppose they could be a bit nastier near the Triumph, but it's still going to be a bunch of AP0 shots. As mentioned though, I think that perhaps the most exciting thing about this datasheet is the way that they can generate miracle dice in basically 3 different ways. Looks like this might be the core driver to actually including Battle Sister squads in your armies now. Having a few of them around might be worth it even if they're not the best damage dealers, if they do keep the miracles flowing. First up, and perhaps easiest, is Defenders of the Faith. This one just nets you a miracle dice for each objective controlled by a unit with this rule at the end of your command phase. It does mean that your opponent will have the chance to blow your units off them before your turn comes around. In general though, they typically tend to be better units to shoot at than standard Battle Sisters, and it seems almost an auto-include to have Battle Sisters on your home field objectives. They should be able to remain at least somewhat safe, and guaranteeing those miracle dice is great. Otherwise, as mentioned, they can also generate them with the Simulacrum. We'll see whether or not that costs points these days, but that means that if a Battle Sister squad kills an enemy unit when you've got a Simulacrum in it, again you generate a miracle dice. I feel like that might be more important on things like Retributors, to be honest though. And finally, it seems that their Cherub rule has been reinterpreted. This one's an upgrade that makes the Battle Sister squad a particularly tempting target for a miracle dice to be thrown at them. If you spend a miracle dice on them, then once per game you can basically just generate one more. Means that it might be a lot more efficient to, say, plug in a 6 to their multi-melter on that unit, as you got a chance to get a miracle dice back after. And it might even be a weird way of recycling bad miracle dice. Maybe plug in a hit roll of a 1 on a bolter or something, and then gets to refresh the miracle dice, hopefully to something useful. Overall, I just can't help but think that the Battle Sister unit is going to be very tempting to have a few copies on, just to get more miracle dice for more important units, and keep the high damage output and long charges coming. Overall, I generally say that it's probably quite a positive preview for the Sisters of Battle. It does look like they've retained the vast majority of their most iconic special rules. Perhaps their most fun mechanic has got even more so going into 10th, and I feel like the Return Fire stratagem and the Ignores Line of Fire Exorcist are both really quite interesting, and could certainly be fun to play in strong lists. Let me know your thoughts on the rules though, and what you make of all this. Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.